Black woman takes the stand, but the entire court freezes when the FBI steps in. Do you think you can outsmart me? You're nothing but a thief. The words echoed in the tense courtroom as a powerful billionaire pointed his finger at a woman who sat calmly at the defense table, accused of a crime she didn't commit. All eyes were on her, waiting for the inevitable verdict. But as the tension reached its peak, the courtroom doors swung open, and an unexpected figure stepped in, a man with undeniable authority and a badge that changed everything. What secrets had been uncovered? And how would this shocking turn of events unravel the lies and expose the truth? Stay tuned for a story filled with betrayal, resilience, and a twist that will leave you speechless. The morning was unusually crisp for Atlanta, the kind of weather that promised clarity but left you cold regardless. Monica Johnson pulled her coat tighter around her as she approached the grand stone steps of Fulton County Courthouse. The imposing building loomed over her, its tall white columns stretching toward the sky like sentinels of an unreachable justice. Each step she climbed felt heavier than the last, as if the very weight of the accusations against her had seeped into her bones. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick, a strange mix of stale coffee, disinfectant, and tension. Monica tried to ignore the whispers around her as she entered the main hallway. Eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with judgment. She'd become a headline, a face splashed across tabloids and local news under titles like "Corporate Thief Caught Red-Handed" and "Employee Betrays Boss in $2 Million Scandal." She paused outside the courtroom doors. For a moment, the world around her blurred. Her breath caught in her chest and she clutched her purse tighter. Her mind raced back to the life she had built before this nightmare began. Monica had always been proud of her work, starting as an entry-level accountant at Hargrove Real Estate Group. She worked long hours, sacrificed weekends, and even skipped her son's soccer games to climb the ladder. By the time she became the senior financial analyst, she thought she'd made it. Her boss, Stephen Hargrove, a man with more charm than integrity, had always praised her work, until the day everything fell apart. It started with a casual email from Hargrove's assistant, asking her to prepare a financial report on the company's profits. A routine task, or so she thought. As Monica delved deeper into the numbers, discrepancies began to appear. Small at first, almost insignificant, but they didn't add up. Funds were being funneled into accounts she couldn't trace, hidden beneath layers of shell companies. When she brought it to Hargrove's attention, his reaction had been chilling. "You must be mistaken," he said, his voice smooth, but his eyes cold as steel. "Don't look into this further, Monica. You wouldn't want to ruin your promising career over a misunderstanding." The memory made her shiver. She hadn't stopped looking. She couldn't. It was against everything she stood for. But just a week later, she was the one in handcuffs, escorted out of her office by police officers in full view of her stunned colleagues. The charges? Embezzlement. Monica closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself back to the present. She wasn't going to let fear break her. Not today. Her son Tyler was counting on her. She pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, and all conversation stopped. The gallery was packed, every seat taken by curious spectators, reporters scribbling notes and her few supporters, a smattering of friends and colleagues who still believed in her innocence. At the front of the room, Stephen Hargrove sat with his high-priced legal team, looking every bit the untouchable tycoon. His tailored suit screamed money, his calm demeanor exuded confidence, and his faint smirk was a reminder of how easily he thought he'd won. Monica kept her chin high as she walked to the defendant's table. Her lawyer, David Carrington, greeted her with a small nod. He was a seasoned attorney, known for his sharp mind and unyielding determination, but even he had admitted this case would be an uphill battle. The prosecution's evidence was damning, and Hargrove had resources Monica couldn't match. The judge, Martha Ellison, entered the room with a stern expression, her gavel echoing through the silence as she called the court to order. "Case number 24, 2087, the clerk announced. The State of Georgia versus Monica Johnson. Monica sat rigid in her chair as the opening arguments began. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man with a voice that dripped with conviction, wasted no time painting her as a cunning thief. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing in front of them, "this is a case of betrayal. The defendant, Monica Johnson, was entrusted with the financial well-being of Hargrove Real Estate Group. She was given access to the company's deepest secrets, its lifeblood. And what did she do with that trust? She exploited it." Monica clenched her fists under the table. The prosecutor spoke as if he knew her, as if he had been there when she spent sleepless nights poring over spreadsheets, trying to make sense of the discrepancies she found. He made her sound like a criminal mastermind, not a hard-working mother trying to do the right thing. When it was David's turn, his voice was calm but firm. "This case is not about betrayal," he said, locking eyes with the jury. "It's about deception, and the true deception lies in the prosecution's evidence. A web of lies spun to protect the real culprit, Stephen Hargrove." Hargrove's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair as if the accusation didn't faze him. The day stretched on with witness testimonies and arguments that felt more like theater than justice. Monica's heart sank as one of her former colleagues, someone she thought was her friend, took the stand and testified against her, claiming they'd seen her acting suspicious with company files. When the court recessed for the day, Monica stepped outside into the biting cold. Her lawyer reassured her they still had a chance, but doubt gnawed at her. As she walked toward her car, she noticed two men standing at a distance watching her. They were dressed in plain black suits, their expressions unreadable. Monica felt a shiver run down her spine, but before she could dwell on it, they turned and disappeared into the crowd. Something was happening, something bigger than this trial. She could feel it, but for now all she could do was brace herself for the storm ahead. The next morning, Monica sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as though it could steady the tremor in her hands. The chill from the night before lingered, frosting the edges of her windshield. Her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror, tired but resolute. She had barely slept, her mind replaying every detail of the trial's first day. The sharp words of the prosecutor, the betrayal of her colleague, and Hargrove's smug confidence. It all felt like a noose tightening around her, but she had to keep going. For Tyler. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo of her 10-year-old son. His smile beamed at her, a stark contrast to the weight she carried. Tyler was too young to understand the complexities of the case, but he knew enough to sense his mother's pain. "I believe in you, Mom," he had whispered the night before, wrapping his small arms around her neck. Those words were her anchor, her reminder that she couldn't afford to falter. The courthouse was already bustling when she walked inside. Reporters with cameras jostled for position near the entrance, calling out questions she ignored. "Miss Johnson, do you have anything to say about the accusations? Are you guilty, Miss Johnson?" Monica kept her head down and pushed through the crowd, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She could feel their eyes following her, their whispered judgments hanging in the air like smoke. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged than the day before. Stephen Hargrove was already seated at his table, chatting casually with his legal team as though he were at a social event. His polished demeanor only added to Monica's frustration. How could he sit there so composed, knowing what he had done? David Carrington greeted her with a firm handshake. "Are you ready for today?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Monica nodded, though she wasn't sure if the motion was more for him or herself. "Do we have a chance?" David's expression softened. "Monica, this case is more than just about evidence. It's about who they want to believe. Right now, Hargrove is counting on his wealth and reputation to carry him through. But trust me, arrogance like his always leaves a trail. We'll find it." His words gave her a glimmer of hope, though it felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. The session began with the continuation of the prosecution's case. They called another witness, Linda Meyer, Hargrove's personal assistant. Linda's testimony was damning, delivered with a precision that felt rehearsed. She claimed to have seen Monica frequently accessing restricted financial files late at night. "She was always so secretive about it," Linda said, her voice laced with feigned innocence. "I didn't think much of it at first, but now it all makes sense. She was trying to cover her tracks." Monica's jaw clenched. Linda had been one of the few people she trusted at the company, someone she'd shared lunches and laughs with. Now she sat on the witness stand, weaving lies without so much as a flicker of guilt. David cross-examined her, but Linda stuck to her story, her responses calculated and precise. As the prosecution rested its case for the day, Monica felt the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her. She glanced at the jury, trying to read their expressions. Most looked neutral, but a few avoided her gaze, their faces hard with judgment. The judge announced a recess, and Monica found herself wandering outside, needing air to clear her head. She stood at the base of the courthouse steps, staring out at the city that had once felt like home, but now seemed alien. "Miss Johnson," a voice called, startling her. She turned to see the two men from the day before, the ones in black suits. They were closer now, their presence deliberate and imposing. One of them, tall with sharp features and piercing eyes, stepped forward and flashed a badge. "Special Agent Marcus Reed, FBI," he said, his voice calm but firm. The other man, shorter and stockier, stood silently behind him, his expression unreadable. Monica's heart skipped a beat. "FBI, what do you want with me?" "We need to talk," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not here. It's important." Her instinct was to refuse, to tell them she didn't have time for more stress or accusations. But something in Marcus's eyes stopped her. He wasn't looking at her with suspicion like everyone else had. He looked concerned. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Fine. Where?" They led her to a quiet conference room inside the courthouse. The walls were plain, the table bare, but the air inside felt heavy with significance. Monica sat across from the two agents, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Miss Johnson," Marcus began, leaning forward. "We've been monitoring Stephen Hargrove for over a year. He's under investigation for multiple federal crimes, including money laundering, tax fraud, and embezzlement." Monica blinked, the words washing over her like cold water. "What does that have to do with me?" Marcus exchanged a glance with his partner before continuing. "We believe you're being framed. Hargrove is using you as a scapegoat to cover his tracks. The discrepancies you found in the financial records? They're part of a much larger scheme." Her breath caught in her throat. It was what she had suspected all along, but hearing it confirmed by the FBI felt surreal. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Marcus said, his tone serious, "your trial is just the beginning. Hargrove thinks he's untouchable, but he's made mistakes, big ones, and we need your help to bring him down." Monica stared at them, her mind racing. The weight of their words settled over her, a mix of relief and fear. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things, but the idea of taking on Stephen Hargrove, a man with so much power, terrified her. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. "Then Hargrove walks free, and you take the fall for everything. But if you work with us, we can protect you and make sure justice is served." Monica's hands clenched into fists. She thought of Tyler, of the life she'd worked so hard to build, and of the lies that had nearly destroyed her. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "But I need to know one thing. Can you guarantee my son's safety?" Marcus nodded. "We'll make sure he's safe. You have my word." As she walked out of the room, Monica felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't alone. The sun hung low in the Atlanta sky as Monica left the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps. She paused for a moment, gripping the cold metal of the railing, her mind reeling from her meeting with the FBI. The revelation that Stephen Hargrove was under investigation for federal crimes should have brought her relief, but instead, it brought questions. Why hadn't the FBI intervened sooner? Why had they let her endure this trial, this public humiliation? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her purse. She pulled it out to see Tyler's name flashing on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered, her voice softer now, her heart aching for a semblance of normalcy. "Hey, Mom," Tyler said, his voice bright despite everything. "Did you eat lunch today? You always forget when you're stressed." Monica felt a lump form in her throat. Even at 10 years old, Tyler had an uncanny ability to sense her emotions. "I grabbed a sandwich," she lied, though her stomach churned with nothing but coffee and nerves. "How was school?" "It was good. I got an A on my math quiz," he exclaimed, the pride in his voice momentarily lifting the weight off her shoulders. "That's amazing, baby. I'm so proud of you," she said, forcing a smile that she hoped he could hear through the phone. "I'm proud of you too, Mom," Tyler said after a pause. "You're gonna win, right?" Monica closed her eyes, the weight of his faith in her pressing against the fragile hope she was clinging to. "I'm doing everything I can, Tyler. I promise." As she ended the call, her resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her son, for their future. But the path ahead was treacherous, and her alliance with the FBI felt as fragile as a house of cards. Monica sat at her small dining table, papers and files spread out in front of her. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the occasional rustle of pages and the distant hum of traffic outside. David Carrington had left her with case notes and strategies to review, but her focus kept drifting back to her meeting with the FBI. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. "This is Marcus Reed. Can we talk?" She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had agreed to help them, but the weight of that decision was just beginning to sink in. Finally, she typed back, "Yes." A minute later, her phone rang. "Miss Johnson." Marcus's voice came through the line, calm and steady. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation earlier. Are you alone?" "Yes," she said, glancing around her small apartment, though she already knew the answer. "Good. There's something you need to know," Marcus said, his tone lowering. "Hargrove is dangerous. He has connections, political, financial, and otherwise. If he finds out you're cooperating with us, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Monica felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of retaliation are we talking about? "Intimidation, threats, maybe worse," Marcus admitted. "But we'll be monitoring you closely. You're not alone in this." She didn't find his words as comforting as he probably intended. "Why me? Why did you wait until now to tell me all of this?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, as though Marcus was carefully choosing his words. "Because we needed to be certain. If we'd intervened too soon, it could have jeopardized our investigation. Hargrove is careful, but he's also arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. That arrogance will be his downfall." Monica leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the scattered papers on the table. "And what do you need from me?" "For now, nothing public," Marcus said. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Testify. Let the trial play out. But if you have any information, anything you remember from your time at the company that didn't sit right, tell us. It could make the difference." Monica sighed, her mind flashing back to the late nights she'd spent combing through spreadsheets and balance sheets, trying to piece together the puzzle of Hargrove's finances. "There was a lot that didn't sit right," she said quietly. "But I'll look through my notes again." "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice softening. "I know this isn't easy, Miss Johnson, but you're stronger than you think." She ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over her. The stakes were higher than she'd imagined, and the danger felt closer now, like a shadow creeping at the edges of her life. The courtroom buzzed with subdued chatter as Monica entered, her head held high despite the exhaustion etched into her features. She noticed the way people looked at her, some with pity, others with disdain. Stephen Hargrove sat at his table, as polished and smug as ever, his expression unreadable. As the trial resumed, David called his first witness, a former auditor for Hargrove Real Estate Group, a man named Calvin Morrow. Calvin's testimony was cautious, but he confirmed that he had been fired after raising questions about irregularities in the company's financial reports. "Did you ever speak to Mr. Hargrove directly about these irregularities?" David asked, his tone measured. "I did," Calvin said, his voice steady, "but he dismissed my concerns, told me it wasn't my job to question his decisions." The prosecutor attempted to discredit Calvin, pointing out that he had signed a non-disclosure agreement upon his termination. But David pressed on, slowly chipping away at the narrative Hargrove had built. Monica watched the jury closely, searching for any sign that they were beginning to see the cracks in the prosecution's case. By the end of the day, she felt a small flicker of hope. But as she stepped out of the courthouse, she spotted a black SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Her pulse quickened. She hurried to her car, glancing over her shoulder as she unlocked the door. The SUV didn't move, but its presence was enough to unsettle her. As she drove away, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Stay vigilant. We're watching." Monica gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight wasn't just in the courtroom, it was everywhere, and it was only just beginning. The rain started as a light drizzle that morning, draping the city in a soft gray haze. Monica sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. The steam had long dissipated, leaving the surface cold and stagnant, much like her thoughts. She had spent the night poring over old notes, trying to recall every detail from her time at Hargrove Real Estate Group. The margins of her notebooks were filled with scribbled annotations and hastily drawn charts, all pointing to one undeniable truth. The financial discrepancies were deliberate. Hargrove had orchestrated the entire scheme. But proving it? That seemed insurmountable. The distant hum of Tyler's morning cartoons was the only thing that tethered her to reality. Her son sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, laughing at animated characters who knew nothing of trials or betrayals. Monica envied his innocence. She shook her head and glanced at the clock. It was almost time to leave. Grabbing her coat, she called out to Tyler, "Sweetheart, grab your backpack. Mrs. Lane will be here soon." Tyler looked up, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Are you going to be okay today, Mom?" The question lingered in the air, heavier than Monica expected. She knelt in front of him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I'll be fine, baby. You just focus on school, okay?" He nodded, but his worried expression didn't waver. As Monica kissed his forehead, she felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let him see her break. The courtroom was colder that day, or maybe it was just Monica's nerves. As she took her seat at the defense table, she noticed a subtle shift in the room's energy. Whispers flitted through the gallery, and even the jury seemed more alert. Something was different. David leaned over, his voice low. "Hargrove's legal team filed a motion this morning. They're trying to exclude Calvin Morrow's testimony." Monica's stomach tightened. "Can they do that?" "They can try," David replied, his tone clipped. "But I'll fight it." The judge entered, her gavel silencing the murmurs. "Before we proceed with the trial," Judge Ellison began, her gaze sweeping the room, "the court will hear arguments regarding the admissibility of Calvin Morrow's testimony." The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor, Mr. Morrow's testimony is irrelevant and prejudicial. His employment at Hargrove Real Estate Group ended years before the alleged embezzlement occurred. Allowing his testimony would only confuse the jury." David rose, his presence commanding. "Your Honor, Mr. Morrow's testimony is not only relevant but critical. It establishes a pattern of behavior by Stephen Hargrove, a pattern of dismissing employees who question his financial practices. The jury deserves to hear it." Judge Ellison leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. After a moment, she nodded. "The court will allow Mr. Morrow's testimony to stand." A small wave of relief washed over Monica, but it was short-lived. Across the room, Hargrove's jaw tightened, his composed facade cracking for the first time. It was subtle, a slight clench of his fists, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. But Monica saw it. He wasn't invincible after all. During the lunch recess, Monica found herself alone in the courthouse hallway, her steps echoing against the tiled floor. She was on her way to a quiet corner to gather her thoughts when she spotted Marcus Reed leaning casually against the wall near the vending machines. He gestured for her to follow him into a nearby conference room. Once inside, he shut the door and folded his arms. "We've found something," he said without preamble. Monica's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Marcus pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table. "This is a list of wire transfers linked to Hargrove shell companies. These accounts funnel money offshore, and some of the transactions coincide with the dates you flagged in your reports." Monica leaned over the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving between accounts with names she didn't recognize. This proves he was laundering money," she whispered. "It's a start," Marcus said, his tone cautious. "But we need more. Do you recognize any of these account names or recipients?" Monica frowned, her mind racing. One name stood out: Allegro Investments. She had seen it before, buried in a stack of invoices that Hargrove insisted were routine business expenses. At the time, it hadn't raised a red flag, but now it clicked. "This one," she said, pointing to the name. "He used it to justify a payment for a supposed real estate development." Marcus nodded. "That's what we suspected. Allegro Investments doesn't exist, it's a front." Monica's chest tightened. "What happens now?" Marcus's gaze was steady. "We're building a case, but you need to stay focused on the trial. If Hargrove suspects you're working with us, it could jeopardize everything." She nodded, though the weight of their conversation settled heavily on her shoulders. As she left the conference room, her thoughts churned. The walls were closing in on Hargrove, but the danger felt closer than ever. The afternoon session brought new tensions. The defense called its first witness, a junior accountant from Hargrove Real Estate Group. She was young, nervous, and visibly uncomfortable as she recounted her experiences working under Hargrove. I noticed discrepancies in the accounts," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when I brought it up, I was told not to worry about it." "Who told you that?" David pressed. The accountant hesitated, her eyes darting toward Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove," she said finally. The room erupted in murmurs, silenced only by the judge's gavel. Hargrove's expression darkened, his mask of confidence slipping further. Monica watched him closely, a flicker of satisfaction igniting in her chest. For the first time, it felt like the truth was breaking through the cracks. That evening, as Monica drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The black SUV she had seen earlier reappeared in her rearview mirror, maintaining a steady distance. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow bursts. When she pulled into her apartment complex, the SUV slowed but didn't stop. It lingered at the entrance for a moment before driving away. Monica sat frozen in her car, her heart pounding. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Stay vigilant, we've got eyes on you." Monica exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The following morning was damp and heavy, the kind of weather that seeped into your bones and lingered. Monica stood in her kitchen, staring at the coffee machine as it sputtered weakly. Her nerves frayed from the previous day's events. Sleep had eluded her, replaced by the haunting image of the black SUV trailing her the night before. She pressed her hands against the counter, her breath slow and deliberate, willing herself to stay calm. Tyler sat at the table swinging his legs idly as he ate a bowl of cereal. He seemed blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her, though she suspected he noticed more than he let on. "Mom," he said, his voice soft. She turned to him, forcing a smile. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you scared?" The question hit her like a punch to the chest. She swallowed hard, walking over to kneel beside him. "A little," she admitted, keeping her voice steady. "But being scared doesn't mean we give up, right?" He nodded, his small hand reaching out to rest on hers. "You're gonna win. I know it." Monica blinked back the sting of tears, her resolve hardening. "Thank you, baby. That means everything to me." By the time Monica entered the courthouse, the usual tension had returned, thick and palpable. The hallway was a sea of murmurs and glances, the crowd larger than ever. The trial was drawing attention, the kind of attention Monica wished she could avoid. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was sharper, the air charged with anticipation. Hargrove sat at his table, his demeanor colder than usual, his legal team huddled around him in quiet conversation. Monica noticed the faint lines of strain around his eyes, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. David Carrington greeted her with a nod. "Today's going to be interesting," he said, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "What's this?" Monica asked, opening it. "Witness testimonies and cross-examination strategies," he replied. "We're calling someone who used to work in Hargrove's upper management. They were reluctant to come forward, but I think their story could tip the scales." Monica scanned the document, her heart skipping a beat at the name. Thomas Braden. She remembered him, a senior project manager who had left the company under mysterious circumstances. His departure had sparked rumors, but nothing had ever been confirmed. "What's his connection?" she asked. David's gaze darkened. "He claims Hargrove pressured him to falsify project budgets to cover up financial irregularities. If the jury believes him, it could be a game changer." The trial began with the prosecution continuing to press their narrative, painting Monica as a cunning manipulator who had exploited her position for personal gain. The evidence they presented, emails, financial reports, and questionable transactions, was overwhelming on the surface. But Monica knew how carefully it had been orchestrated. When it was David's turn, he wasted no time calling Thomas Braden to the stand. The man who entered was a shadow of the confident project manager Monica remembered. His suit hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "Mr. Braden," David began, his tone measured, "can you tell the court why you left Hargrove Real Estate Group?" Thomas hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I left because I couldn't do it anymore," he said finally. "Couldn't do what?" "Falsify budgets," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "Mr. Hargrove instructed me to inflate project costs and redirect funds into accounts that didn't match the projects. When I questioned it, he threatened to ruin my career." The courtroom erupted in whispers, silenced only by the judge's gavel. David stepped closer, his expression calm but intent. "Did you have any direct communication with Mr. Hargrove about these instructions?" Thomas nodded. "He gave them to me personally. He said it was for the good of the company and that I shouldn't ask questions." "Did you document any of this?" "I kept some emails," Thomas admitted, his voice steadier now. "I was afraid they might come in handy one day." David handed a stack of printed emails to the court clerk, who distributed copies to the judge and jury. The emails were concise but damning, clearly outlining Hargrove's directives to alter financial records. Monica watched Hargrove from across the room, her heart pounding. His expression had darkened, his jaw set in a rigid line. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. As expected, Hargrove's legal team fought back hard, attempting to discredit Thomas. They pointed out inconsistencies in his timeline, his departure from the company, and his supposed motives. "You're a disgruntled former employee, aren't you, Mr. Braden?" the prosecutor asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Isn't it true that you were fired for poor performance?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "I resigned because I refused to be part of something illegal." The prosecutor sneered. "And yet you only decided to come forward now, years later. Why is that?" Thomas hesitated, glancing briefly at Monica. "Because I see what's happening to Miss Johnson, and I know it's wrong. She's being scapegoated just like I was." The prosecutor tried to press further, but the damage had already been done. Thomas's testimony, coupled with the emails, left a lingering question in the minds of the jury. What else was Hargrove hiding? When the court adjourned for the day, Monica stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air. The crowd of reporters had grown larger, their cameras and microphones thrust toward her as she exited. "Miss Johnson, what do you think of today's testimony? Do you believe the jury is on your side now? Is Thomas Braden's story enough to clear your name?" She ignored them, her pace quickening as she headed toward her car. But just as she reached it, she noticed the black SUV again, parked at the far end of the lot. This time, the engine was running. Her phone buzzed in her purse. It was a message from Marcus. "We're tracking the SUV, stay calm." Monica exhaled shakily, glancing over her shoulder before climbing into her car. She drove home in silence, her grip on the steering wheel tight. The shadows around her were growing darker, but so was her resolve. The soft hum of Monica's car filled the silence as she drove home that evening. The rain had returned, painting the streets in a slick sheen that reflected the city lights like fractured glass. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her pulse quickening every time she thought she saw the black SUV in the distance. Though Marcus had assured her the FBI was tracking the vehicle, the weight of its presence still pressed on her chest like a stone. Her apartment felt colder than usual when she stepped inside, the emptiness amplifying the echoes of her own footsteps. Tyler was staying overnight with Mrs. Lane, her trusted neighbor, and the silence only made her thoughts louder. Monica locked the door behind her, checked it twice, and leaned against it with a heavy sigh. The day's events played over and over in her mind. Thomas Braden's testimony, the cracks it revealed in Hargrove's carefully constructed facade, and the prosecutor's relentless attempts to discredit him. For the first time, Monica felt the tide might be turning in her favor, but the victory was fragile. Hargrove wasn't the type to go down quietly. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling. On the counter lay the folder Marcus had given her earlier, filled with evidence the FBI had compiled against Hargrove. She opened it again, flipping through the pages slowly, methodically. One name kept jumping out at her: Allegro Investments. She'd seen it in the company's records, disguised as a vendor or partner, but she hadn't questioned it deeply at the time. Now, knowing it was a shell company, the pieces started to align. She sat at the table, jotting down notes, her pen scratching against the paper in the quiet room. Patterns emerged as she connected the dots: dates, amounts, recipients. Hargrove had been careful, but not infallible. A sudden knock at the door startled her, the sound sharp and unexpected in the silence. Monica froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone, and after the day she'd had, her nerves were already stretched thin. Slowly, she walked to the door, peering through the peephole. A man in a delivery uniform stood outside, holding a package. "Miss Johnson," he called, his voice muffled through the door. She hesitated. "Yes?" "Package for you. It's urgent." Monica's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. "Leave it by the door," she said firmly. The man hesitated but finally nodded, placing the package on the ground before walking away. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade, then unlocked the door and retrieved the package, her hands trembling. The box was plain, unmarked except for her name scrawled on the top in neat handwriting. She brought it to the table, her mind racing. Who would send her something at this hour? Carefully, she opened it, revealing a single envelope resting on top of a stack of documents. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the typed text. "Miss Johnson, this is bigger than you think. Stay quiet or you and your son will pay the price." Her breath caught, her chest tightening as fear gripped her. She dropped the letter, her hands shaking as she rifled through the rest of the box. The documents were copies of her emails, financial reports, and other records she had worked on at Hargrove Real Estate Group. Each one had been annotated in red ink, highlighting supposed errors or inconsistencies. It was a threat, a message to let her know that someone was watching her every move. Monica arrived at the courthouse with a heavy heart, her mind clouded by the ominous warning. She clutched her purse tightly as she walked through the bustling hallway, the familiar weight of judgmental stares pressing down on her. David noticed her unease immediately. "You okay?" he asked as she took her seat beside him. Monica hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The session began with the prosecution attempting to regain control of the narrative, but their arguments felt strained, their confidence shaken by the previous day's revelations. Hargrove's legal team was on the defensive now, and it showed. David called his next witness, Elaine Carter, a former accountant at Hargrove Real Estate Group who had worked closely with Monica. Elaine's testimony was cautious but clear, corroborating Monica's claims about the discrepancies in the financial records. "Miss Carter," David said, pacing in front of the witness stand, "in your professional opinion, were the irregularities you and Miss Johnson discovered accidental or deliberate?" Elaine glanced at the jury, her expression solemn. "Deliberate," she said. "The discrepancies were too consistent to be mistakes. They were hidden across multiple accounts, all leading back to the same shell companies. And who was responsible for these transactions?" Elaine hesitated, her gaze drifting toward Hargrove. "Stephen Hargrove," she said finally. The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, the tension palpable. Monica stole a glance at Hargrove, whose calm mask had slipped further, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the arms of his chair. During the afternoon recess, Monica stepped outside to clear her head. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and spectators, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. She stood to the side, her back against the cold stone wall, trying to ground herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a new text from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake. Back down now." Monica's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she stared at the message, her mind racing. She looked around the crowd, scanning for anyone who might be watching her, but no one stood out. The phone buzzed again. "Your son's safety depends on your silence." The words blurred on the screen as tears filled her eyes. Her first instinct was to call Marcus, to tell him everything. But she hesitated. What if the threat was real? What if she couldn't protect Tyler? A hand on her shoulder startled her, and she turned to see Marcus standing beside her, his expression calm but concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said quietly. Monica swallowed hard, clutching her phone tightly. "I got another threat," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Let me see." She handed him the phone, and he read the messages, his expression darkening. "They're trying to scare you, don't let them." "How can I not?" she shot back, her voice rising. "They mentioned my son, Marcus. This isn't just about me anymore." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got people watching your apartment and your son's school. No one's getting near him, I promise. But you have to stay strong, Monica. If you back down now, they win." She nodded, though the fear in her chest didn't ease. As Marcus walked her back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, the stakes growing higher with every passing moment. The night after the threats arrived, Monica found herself staring out the window of her dimly lit apartment. The city below seemed alive, cars weaving through wet streets, their headlights cutting through the haze of light rain. Despite the distant sounds of life, Monica felt utterly isolated. Her phone sat on the table beside her. The messages from the unknown sender burned into her mind. She had forwarded them to Marcus, who promised to trace the number, but the fear still lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her fingers tapped the edge of the windowsill as her thoughts spiraled. The trial was starting to shift in her favor, yet every small victory came with a new threat, a deeper sense of unease. Hargrove was being backed into a corner, and Monica knew a man like him wouldn't go quietly. The faint buzz of her phone startled her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, her heart racing, but it was only a text from Marcus. "We're monitoring. You're safe. Keep pushing forward." The words were meant to reassure her, but they didn't. The fight wasn't just about safety. It was about endurance. How much longer could she keep going? The next morning, Monica arrived at the courthouse under heavy clouds, both in the sky and in her heart. The rain had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. Marcus's words echoed in her mind as she walked through the crowded halls, past the reporters and murmuring spectators. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The kind of energy that promised something pivotal was about to unfold. David was seated at their table, his usual calm demeanor tinged with a sharp focus. "Morning," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "You ready?" Monica nodded, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. "What's the plan today?" "We're introducing evidence that ties Hargrove directly to Allegro Investments," David said, sliding a folder toward her. "It's risky, but if it lands, it could be a turning point." Monica opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. They included bank statements, transaction logs, and internal emails from Hargrove's company, all pointing to Allegro as a shell company used for money laundering. This is huge," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. David nodded. "It is. But Hargrove's legal team will try to discredit it. We need to be prepared for a fight." The session began with the prosecution continuing their efforts to paint Monica as the mastermind behind the alleged embezzlement. The lead prosecutor's voice was sharp and confident, but there was an air of desperation in his tone now, as if he knew the ground was shifting beneath him. When it was David's turn, he approached the bench with a quiet authority. "Your Honor," he began, holding up a stack of papers. "The defense would like to submit these documents into evidence. They directly tie Stephen Hargrove to financial irregularities within Hargrove Real Estate Group." The prosecutor immediately objected, claiming the documents were irrelevant and lacked context. The two lawyers engaged in a heated debate, their voices rising as the judge leaned forward, her expression stern. "Enough," Judge Ellison said finally, her gavel silencing the room. She turned to David. "Mr. Carrington, you may proceed, but tread carefully. The burden of proof is on you." David nodded and turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, these documents represent a trail of deception. They show how Stephen Hargrove used his position of power to siphon money into a shell company under the guise of legitimate business transactions. These transactions align with the discrepancies my client, Monica Johnson, discovered and attempted to report." As David presented the evidence, Monica watched the jury closely. Some members leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they studied the papers handed to them by the clerk. Others glanced at Hargrove, whose calm facade was beginning to crack. "Now," David continued, "I'd like to call a special witness to the stand, FBI Special Agent Marcus Reed." A hush fell over the courtroom as Marcus entered, his tall, composed figure drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He walked to the stand with a calm confidence, his presence radiating authority. After being sworn in, he adjusted the microphone and turned his gaze toward David. "Agent Reed," David began, "can you explain your involvement in the investigation into Stephen Hargrove?" Marcus nodded. "The FBI has been conducting a federal investigation into Mr. Hargrove and his company for over a year. We have reason to believe he's involved in money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud, using shell companies like Allegro Investments to funnel illicit funds." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Monica glanced at Hargrove, whose jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. David continued, "Can you confirm whether these documents submitted today align with the evidence collected by your investigation?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "These documents are consistent with our findings. They provide further proof of Mr. Hargrove's illegal activities." The prosecutor attempted to object, claiming the FBI's involvement was irrelevant to the case against Monica, but Judge Ellison overruled him. "Agent Reed," David said, "in your professional opinion, was Monica Johnson aware of Mr. Hargrove's scheme?" "No," Marcus said without hesitation. "Miss Johnson's role was limited to financial analysis. When she discovered the discrepancies, she tried to report them, but she was silenced and later framed to divert attention from the real culprit. Monica felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tempered by the weight of the moment. The truth was finally coming to light, but the fight wasn't over. The courtroom descended into chaos as the implications of Marcus's testimony sank in. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and spectators whispered in shock. Judge Ellison called for order, her gavel echoing through the room. Hargrove's legal team scrambled to respond, but their carefully constructed defense was unraveling. Hargrove himself sat rigid, his face pale, and his composure slipping with every passing moment. David leaned toward Monica, his voice low. "This is it. He's cornered. Now we just have to wait and see how he reacts." Monica nodded, though her heart still pounded in her chest. The danger wasn't gone, not yet, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. As the session adjourned for the day, Monica left the courthouse under the watchful eyes of the media and the FBI. The black SUV was gone, but the sense of being followed hadn't left her. She stepped into her apartment that evening, exhausted but resolute. On her kitchen counter lay another envelope, this one smaller and addressed in the same neat handwriting as the package from the night before. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing a single slip of paper. "You may have won today, but this isn't over." Monica clenched the note in her fist, her fear giving way to anger. She was done being intimidated, done being silenced. The storm was far from over, but now, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to win. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Word had spread quickly about the FBI's involvement, and now reporters, spectators, and even legal observers crowded into every available seat. Monica entered the room with her head held high, though the weight of the note from the previous night still lingered in the back of her mind. David met her at the defense table, his demeanor steady but energized. "Today's the day," he said, handing her a printout. "What's this?" Monica asked, scanning the document. "Evidence tying Allegro Investments to offshore accounts in Hargrove's name. Marcus and his team found it last night." Monica's breath caught. This is enough to take him down, isn't it?" David nodded. "It's the final nail in the coffin, but Hargrove's not going down without a fight. Stay ready." The session began with the prosecution desperately trying to reframe the narrative, but the weight of the FBI's testimony hung heavily in the air. The jury, once skeptical, now seemed wary of the prosecution's arguments, their expressions reflecting doubt and unease. David rose with calm authority. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence that further establishes Stephen Hargrove's involvement in financial crimes." The prosecutor immediately objected, but Judge Ellison waved him off. "Mr. Carrington, proceed." David presented the new documents detailing offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, all linked to Allegro Investments and directly tied to Hargrove. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David said, addressing them directly, "this evidence leaves no room for doubt. Stephen Hargrove orchestrated this entire scheme, using Miss Johnson as a scapegoat to cover his tracks. He leveraged his power and influence to manipulate not just his employees, but this very courtroom." The jury leaned forward, their attention riveted. Even Judge Ellison seemed more engaged, her stern expression softening slightly as she reviewed the documents. David turned to Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove, would you like to take the stand to refute this evidence?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Hargrove. His legal team whispered furiously, but he remained seated, his face pale and rigid. "No," David continued. "Then let the evidence speak for itself." As the day wore on, the pressure on Hargrove became palpable. His once confident demeanor crumbled, replaced by visible agitation. Monica watched him closely, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment he could no longer hide. Finally, during a brief recess, it happened. Hargrove stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You think I'm going to sit here and let this farce continue?" Judge Ellison banged her gavel. "Mr. Hargrove, control yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt." But Hargrove was beyond reason. He pointed at Monica, his face twisted with rage. She's nothing, a nobody. She didn't deserve to be in my company, let alone accuse me of anything. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Monica sat frozen, her mind reeling. His words, venomous and unrestrained, were more damning than any evidence David could present. Judge Ellison called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Hargrove, you've just made this court's decision much easier. By the end of the day, the jury had reached a verdict. Monica sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together as she waited, her breath shallow and uneven. The foreperson stood holding a folded piece of paper. In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Monica Johnson, we find the defendant not guilty. Monica's heart stopped for a moment, and then the words sank in. Relief flooded her body, her vision blurring with tears. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his own expression one of quiet triumph. The judge turned her attention to the prosecution. Given the evidence presented, the court will now open a formal investigation into Stephen Hargrove's activities. This trial is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the room. As reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, Monica slipped into a side room with Marcus. He handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the emotions of the day. "Official confirmation," Marcus said. "Hargrove's assets have been frozen. He's under federal investigation, and he'll be facing charges for money laundering and fraud." Monica opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the document inside. It was real. It was finally over. She looked up at Marcus, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for everything." Marcus smiled faintly. "You earned this, and you proved something today to everyone in that courtroom and beyond." Weeks later, Monica sat on the couch in her small apartment. Tyler snuggled beside her as they watched his favorite cartoon. Life was slowly returning to normal, though the experience had left its mark. A knock at the door startled her, but when she opened it, she found David standing there with a wide grin and a bottle of champagne. "Thought we could celebrate properly," he said, stepping inside. Monica laughed, the sound light and free for the first time in months. "I think we've earned it." As they toasted to her freedom and Hargrove's downfall, Monica felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She had fought against impossible odds and won, not just for herself but for her son and her future. And as she looked at Tyler's smiling face, she knew that no threat, no shadow, could ever dim the light they had reclaimed. And just like that, justice was served. Monica didn't just clear her name, she exposed the lies of a powerful man, and proved that courage and truth can prevail, even in the darkest of times. Her story is a reminder that no matter how high the odds are stacked, perseverance can turn the tide. If this story inspired you or kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. I've got more incredible stories coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.